coalition forces and begin striking selected targets of military importance.
It would be a decision which could only be taken once.
There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured.
This morning, I want to talk about the future of Europe.
Now, let us remind you that the topic for the day is basically the looming conflict, or maybe there is no conflict, but our experts say there is, between China, Japan, and now even the United States and South Korea.
Should we call it growing tensions, Dimitri?
Growing tensions. Okay, let's not call it an escalation of a conflict because there is no open conflict there. But let us remind you that China has established a zone around the Shikoku Islands, saying that
Diaoyu Islands.
Diaoyu in Chinese, yes. Saying that every aircraft flying through this airspace should report in on its flight intentions, time, nationality, etc., etc. Whereas so far nations have been ignoring this on purpose, it seems, flying provocatively through this zone without any kind of report.
Well, in fact...
and happily reporting about it, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, just to remind our listeners again, this step on the part of China was a reaction to a similar initiative from Japan, which was the first one to establish a similar zone over the disputed islands. Mm-hmm. So, all in all, it seems that this is hardly a step which could contribute to establishing more constructive relationship within the region, or perhaps relieving the tension.
We have to just remember, basic essential facts that China and Japan are the second and third largest economies in the world. And actually, mutual trade between them is also very, very significant. There's around 10 million Chinese people, citizens, working for Japanese corporations on the territory of China, just for them. Basically, it's kind of outsourcing. This is totally normal. But the thing is that, while economic ties are very strong, diplomatic ties are, well, if they exist, they are very weak, or they are blind or deaf.
Well,
there is no dialogue, basically.
We should remember that nationalism nowadays is on the rise, both in China and Japan.
Well, China is actually accusing Japan of, and Shinzo Abe, of mounting nationalism within the country.
So this is a difficult reciprocal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But now I suggest we could listen to our Chinese expert, Dr. Yu Zi, who is professor in politics and international relations at the University of New South Wales in Australia.
And let's just remind our listeners that there was a bigger part of that interview was in the first part of Burning Point, which is available on voiceofrussia.com in case you missed it.
And now Professor is focusing on the prospects of further relations between China and Japan.
Yeah, I think it's quite easy and convenient for the Japanese to use it as something to testify, for example, by Abe, to testify to the parliament that now we are in danger. We have to do something about our peaceful constitution, for example, Article 9. Therefore, this is convenient excuse for the Japanese right-wing politicians to press ahead with their search for so-called the normalized state, which is really mean that they will go for some normal militarization of the national defense.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Dr. Yu Zi, Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of New South Wales.
Burning Point.
And now I feel that we definitely need someone who could analyze the situation from the neutral stance.
Okay, let's talk to Andrei Korneyev. He's Deputy Director of the Institute of Asian and African Studies at the Moscow State University.
Well, actually, it's a set of lines on the map. And if you look at the map of the East Asia region, this area is somewhere between China, Japan and South Korea. It's the sea area, and it's a very big area. And it somehow looks like it's a buffer zone between Japan and China. So one could even argue that China is trying to distance itself from Japan, or maybe trying to have an early warning opportunity in case of any intrusion into Chinese territory. We have seen tensions rising in recent years over certain conflicts between China, Japan, and also between two Koreas. And we have seen that there are now very frequent air maneuvers, air drills, and frequently there are incidents when planes enter the space, the territorial space. So I think that it looks like as if China's leadership is trying to have the initiative, to take the initiative and probably to impose its own rules of the game onto Japan as well as other players in the region.
What do you think could be the consequences of the move? Because when we spoke to a Chinese expert, he seemed pretty much sure that this is not going to trigger off more tension and more disputes. However, when we spoke to a Western expert, he had an opposite view of the situation.
Well, we have already seen the tensions rising, especially when the two B-52s, the American bombers, intruded into this so-called identification zone. Luckily, China showed restraint and they did not try to engage in conflict with these two planes. So we have seen some restraint, but you could hardly say that this new measure is helping to soothe the tensions in the area. I think that we will probably see some escalation in the coming days and weeks.
Professor, now, when we are talking about those B-52 flights, why do you think the Americans were the first ones to make this gesture, which, by the way, was followed by the Air Force from South Korea and Japan? What role is America going to play, the United States? What is it going to play in the new situation here?
Well, I think that the Americans probably sensed that this initiative by the Chinese side is a unilateral measure to impose its own rules of the game in the area where other countries would like to see the United States play a much more active role, counterbalancing the rising Chinese influence. So I think that President Obama, up to this moment, has actually performed. He has demonstrated that the United States is willing to stand behind Japan, South Korea, and probably defend the status quo in the region and not allowing the Chinese side to have an advantage or impose its own rules on other players. So we could see these developments in this light. And if we take the motives behind the Chinese side, there is a lot of theories, and one theory is even claiming that probably there are internal origins and internal reasons for these very energetic actions by the Chinese government. Probably these factors could be tied with the very complex internal fighting in the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and also this image that Mr. Xi Jinping would like to project as a statesman who is willing to take China to a much more elevated status on world stage, in world affairs.
Well, talking about the internal differences, it was very interesting to see the reaction on the part of the Global Times, which criticized the military for being too slow in their reaction to the B-52 flights. However, do you think that in the present circumstances, China could afford a direct confrontation with the United States?
Well, certainly it does not. It showed very clearly that at this stage China will rather abstain from direct conflict with the United States, and this is good for the region and for other players. We know pretty well that there are hardliners especially in the Chinese army and Air Force, and this is no surprise that this Global Daily, which is a very outspoken mouthpiece of these circles, that they are criticizing the slow, as they see it, reaction by the Chinese military. But I think that generally speaking, Chinese government is, up to this moment, it has shown its ability to walk very carefully, to tread very carefully and avoid these pitfalls and to still maintain stability in the region, because this stability is crucial for the successful economic transformation and economic rise that China is experiencing at this moment.
Professor, on the other hand, do you think that the United States could really afford a confrontation with China?
Well, let me say something opposite. Can the United States afford not to respond to this measure by China? I think this is more important.
But in that case, that shows that the United States are now in a pretty awkward position in the region.
Well, it is. The United States has to play this game of confidence and the protector role that it has assumed. So once it demonstrates weakness, it could spiral into a very difficult situation for the United States. So I think that the decision to send the bombers was tough, but for the United States, I think it was logical. Otherwise, they could have suffered a very massive loss of faith, both internally and in the major capitals of countries of Asia Pacific.
Are we saying that Beijing might be provoking the United States?
Well, up to this point, all experts agree that Beijing is not in a position and it has not enough military might to provoke the United States. But on the other hand, we have seen since the year 2010 or probably even earlier, this new, much more outspoken diplomacy on the part of Beijing. China is capitalizing on its economic rise, on the fact that it's one of the biggest economies. It's the only economy that is still rising very quickly, and that it could probably overtake the United States as the first economy in the year 2016. So China is provoking the United States by the very fact that it is rising very rapidly. So I think that we will see a lot of tensions in the forthcoming months.
But the two economies are linked together so closely that if one of them fails, the second is going to experience really tough times.
Well, that is why I would predict that the confrontation will be interwoven with cooperation. I think that this even could be the bargaining chip on the part of China. So they will continue their full-fledged cooperation with the United States, with Japan, but at the same time trying to bargain for much more elevated position vis-à-vis these two countries.
Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
That was Andrei Korneev, Deputy Director of the Institute of Asian and African Studies at the Moscow State University.
Burning Point.
All right, so I think that was quite interesting that practically all of our experts have said that this will not lead to any kind of open hostilities between the nations.
Between China and the United States, which is very important.
Or China and Japan, apparently, because as we've been saying, economic ties are so important, they're so much intertwined between, one with the other, that it's not in anyone's interest to actually go into an open conflict.
However, we have seen from the previous experience that conflicts tend to develop despite being in no one's interest. So the situation is difficult, and I only hope that reason prevails.
Well, the Huffington Post was looking at this situation in their articles today, and they were writing that, basically quoting Japanese authorities without actually any names, they were saying that it reminds them, Japan, as Huffington Post is saying, this whole situation reminds them of Germany in the 1930s.
What an assessment. So are we heading for the Third World War?
Well, there was no indication to that, but this Japanese authority person who they're quoting has been saying that basically China is just, without anybody's consent, going ahead and capturing territories around it.
I wouldn't remember anyone asking anyone's consent when the Japanese established a similar zone. So, double standards again.
And with this, we apparently end the second part of Burning Point. Thank you very much for